Now, I always like to give the benefit of the doubt to Matthew himself, the apostle, the tax collector, who was called into discipleship in chapter 9, verse 9, as it reads, "As Jesus passed on from there, he saw a man named Matthew sitting at a customs post. He said to him, 'Follow me.' And he got up and followed Jesus." And so what do we know about Matthew? Well, we know first and foremost he was a tax collector, and tax collectors were hated by Jews. Why? Because they were collaborators with the Romans. A tax collector essentially collected taxes. Now, a portion of the taxes went immediately to Caesar in Rome as tribute, while the remaining portion of the tax that was collected went to feed and house and pay the Roman soldiers that were occupying the land of Israel. And so the Jews hated that. The Romans were their oppressors, and here they were paying them to stay there, to be fed and paid. Now, the tax collector also received his compensation by simply skimming off the top. Now, if a tax collector essentially wanted more money, if a tax collector wanted an addition on his house, better clothes, more horses, he simply collected more taxes. Now, the tax collector would know exactly how much needed to go to Rome to appease Caesar in tribute, and how much needed to go to the army. And so after taking care of those two sources, then the tax collector could keep whatever was left over. So if he wanted more money, he simply would collect more taxes. Yet, if you were a Jew, you had no choice. You simply had to pay. If you didn't, the Roman soldiers would come and throw you into jail. And so Jewish tax collectors, which Matthew was, essentially were looked down upon as collaborators who contributed to the occupation of Israel. Next, I'd like to offer you a great piece of artwork painted by the artist Caravaggio, and it's entitled The Call of Matthew. Now, Caravaggio lived in the 16th century in Italy, and many of his pieces of artwork are still in churches throughout Europe. Now, this painting, entitled The Call of Matthew, is rich in symbolism. First, notice the light coming from the window. It falls specifically on Matthew. Matthew is the person seated with the long beard, pointing to himself as the light falls on him. This is the light of Jesus Christ. Now see the symbolism here in the gospel. The light of Christ is always first shining upon him. When Jesus enters our life, he does so as a light, illuminating us. Next, notice Jesus is the man with a beard pointing at Matthew. Notice his hand. Jesus' hand is actually the hand of God in Michelangelo's masterpiece, Creation. Now, Caravaggio went to the Sistine Chapel and studied that great artwork of Michelangelo on the ceiling of the chapel, entitled Creation, depicting God stretching out and touching man's hand and giving life to us, creating the human race. Now, Caravaggio studied that hand and copied it intentionally as he put that hand now on the figure of Jesus in his painting. The symbolism here is incredibly deep. As Matthew is called by Jesus into discipleship, we too are called into a new life in Jesus Christ. We become a new creation ourselves. We are no longer the same person. As Paul writes in 1 Corinthians, it is no longer I who lives, but Christ who lives in me. When we are called into discipleship, into relationship with Jesus Christ, we leave our old self behind, and now we become a new person. And this is what Caravaggio intentionally wanted to explain to us. Notice that Matthew points to himself with a look of astonishment, as if he's saying, "Who, me? You actually want me to come and follow you?" Now, this is powerful. Jesus knows who Matthew is and what he does. Yet, Jesus is the friend of sinners. Jesus knows who we all are. And better yet, he knows what we do. Yet, he points to each and every one of us. He says the same thing to us as he did with Matthew. Come and follow me. My friends, the heart of the spiritual life is recognizing that Jesus is constantly inviting us. He's constantly pointing to us and inviting us into a deeper and deeper relationship with him. Finally, in the picture, you'll see something very subtle. As Jesus points to Matthew, you don't necessarily see all of Jesus. There's a person there blocking him. That person is Peter. Peter is in front of Jesus. Peter now represents the church. And how best do we encounter Jesus except through the church? Through the church's sacraments, we see God present to us. Here, Caravaggio is making a very intentional gesture in the fact that, yes, we see the presence of God in people, places, and events, but in the most concrete and the strongest way, we see the presence of God in the church, in the sacraments, specifically in the sacrament of the Eucharist. In Jesus' body and blood, we have the most concrete encounter with the living Christ. What happens next after Matthew's conversion? Well, Jesus now parties with Matthew as well as with others. It specifically reads in chapter 9, verse 10 through 13. While Jesus was at table in Matthew's house, many tax collectors and sinners came and sat with Jesus and his disciples. The Pharisees saw this, and they said to his disciples, "Why does your teacher eat with tax collectors and sinners?" Jesus heard this and said, "Those who are well do not need a physician, but the sick do. Go and learn the meaning of these words. I desire mercy, not sacrifice. I did not come to call the righteous, but for sinners." The one thing that we have to recognize is that when we are converted, we help others in their road to conversion ourselves. We now are living new lives. We are new people, new creations, as Paul says in 1 Corinthians. And when we start living a new, converted life in Jesus Christ, people will definitely take notice, as they do with Matthew. Jesus took Matthew and called him out. Life that was based upon materialism. Matthew used to be a scoundrel, and now he's living a very virtuous life. Well, what happened? Many people are starting to ask that question. Christ can enter into his life. Well, maybe he can enter into mine. I always tell people, never underestimate the power of your own spiritual life and how you live out your life. It can be a very powerful magnet for others in this world. And the way you live out your spirituality, the way you pray, the frequency in which you pray, attend Mass, the way in which you live a virtuous life, people will definitely stand up and take notice. And you will become a magnet to attract others to a life in Jesus Christ. And see, that's what's happening right here and now with Matthew in his conversion. Matthew was once a scoundrel, yet now he's a new person. He's living a virtuous life. And because of that, now the people that Matthew used to associate with now see that. And now they are attracted to a virtuous life. They are attracted to Jesus Christ. And so, my friends, the way we live our own spirituality can be a conduit to help people draw closer to Christ. Next, as we continue to study the Gospel of Matthew, we come upon the history Well, we realize that Matthew was written approximately between 80 to 90 AD. And we believe that it was written primarily for the Christian community in Antioch, which is present-day Syria. Now, the reason why we come to believe that is because Antioch contained a very large Jewish population. And remember, the Gospel of Matthew was written primarily for a Jewish Christian community. Furthermore, Antioch was primarily a Greek-speaking city. And remember, the Gospel of Matthew was originally written in Greek.